Fun fact, my very first YouTube video was actually on how to integrate Notion and a time tracking tool called Toggle. Fast forward 3 years later and Notion's changed just a tiny little bit. In this video, we're using Notion's new buttons feature to track time directly in Notion without the need of another tool. We're also going to tie this into a larger dashboard to not only track time, but see where time is going by, say, project or by day or week. If you're new to the channel, my name's Dave DeCespedes. I'm a certified Notion consultant, and I help remote teams reach peak performance by building custom workspaces and workflows in Notion. We're going to first take a look at a fully built version of how this time tracking works. This is actually looking at the latest version of a template I've built called Manifest OS, which is relaunching in a couple weeks. Then we're going to build all of these databases from scratch, including tasks, projects, and most importantly, setting up a task template that includes these buttons to start and stop our time tracker. This is looking at the latest version of Manifest OS, but if we jump into the action section, this is basically a collection of base views that are focused on tasks and action items, from looking at meetings to looking at this week. But the area that I want to focus on is this time hub. So this is after roughly a week of using this time tracker, trying to get a sense of where are the biggest insights from the process. Tracking number of minutes, the start and stop time, that's something that we're going to be building in our time tracking hub. But also getting insights to where is our time going related to the parent project, for example. So we're going to look at two ways to build our time tracker. One is just setting up tasks and then being able to create a start and end time, and looking at something a little bit more advanced, setting up multiple time entries for a single task. So it's going to require a little bit more building, but we'll look at the pros and cons of each version. And then also just looking at, in this case, we've got a board view, which breaks down by day, what tasks are we working on and what projects are they related to. So here, this could be pretty useful in terms of grabbing the sum of total minutes, for example, per day. We're looking at comparing the time estimate for the task. So when we're in planning mode, getting a sense of how much time it might take to complete the task versus how much time has been logged in our time tracker. So what we're gonna do first is create a new page called time tracking. So got one started here. And what I'd like to do when setting up new dashboards or databases is just start with a simple outline in terms of what do we want to track on this page. If we're creating new databases, what properties do we need in that database? It could get a little overwhelming when we're applying templates that are doing different things and have properties that we might not find useful or necessary. So getting a clear idea of what we're tracking and how we're tracking it before getting into build mode. So in this case, this outline covers two key databases, projects and tasks. When we get into the advanced version of the time tracker, there's a few additional properties that we're going to be adding. But starting here in terms of getting these databases up and running so that we could see how the time tracking works when we create these start and stop buttons to create new time entries. So first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to add an icon here. So we'll give this an hourglass, and let's just go ahead and add a cover over here. From here, what we're going to do is type /database, and we do have multiple options. What we're going to do is create an inline database so we can see it on this page. We're going to call this projects, and I'm going to open this up so that we can add an icon here as well. And from here, also start to define what properties we want to track for a projects database. So we'll get rid of tags, and we're going to add the status property. So we'll keep this standard for now. And we're going to add a date property. We'll call this timeline so that we can have a start and end date for projects. Let's go ahead and populate this with a few example projects so that we could see real-time entries in action. We're going to create a task database. So we can click /, and then if you know that it's going to be a table view, you can go ahead and type /table. And this will give us the option to either select an existing database, which will create a view of that database, or create a brand new database, which we're going to do. We'll call this tasks. And then similar to the projects, we're going to open this as a full page to then add an icon. This is a check mark. So let's get rid of this tags property. We'll add status, and we'll add due date. We'll change this from date to due date. Now that we have both databases set up, we're going to relate these two databases together, meaning you could now create tasks and relate them to a parent project. So if we click on this plus button, we're going to go to relation and we're going to select projects. Few options here when we're creating a relation between databases. So first, you can set a limit, a scenario being we may want tasks to only have one parent project. So in that case, we would turn this on and set this to one page. And we have the option to show this in the other database. So if we turn this on, that means that in the projects database, it'll create a new property called tasks. So I like to keep this on just as a reminder of what relations are already set up, but there might be scenarios where we don't necessarily need to see this database in the database that it's related to. So we'll click add relation. So we've got this projects. And if we go back into the time tracking page, you'll see that tasks has been added here as well. So don't need to see that here. So we're just going to hide that and then go into tasks. And now we'll do the same thing where we'll populate this with a few example tasks. So now that we have our databases built, let's go back to our outline and make sure we've captured everything. So we've got projects, tasks, we've got that relation set up. So the next thing we're going to do is set up our additional time tracking property. So this is going to allow us to create buttons where we can start our timer, stop the timer, and capture the number of minutes we're spending per task. If we jump back into the task database, you can also open any entry within the database to pull up the properties here and add or edit properties that's going to affect the entire database. So we want to first add a few date properties. We're going to add a start, and we're just going to change the icon so that we don't get confused with the due date. And we're going to give this a stopwatch. And then we're going to duplicate this to also add an end property. A couple other properties that we want to have are the timer status. We're going to create a select property and we'll call this timer status. And we're going to add two statuses. One is going to be running and the other is going to be stopped. And let's change the colors. This is going to be green and red. And the last one, which is a simple formula, is just going to get the delta between the start and end times to give us the number of minutes that we spent on this task. So we're going to add a property and then select formula, and we'll call this minutes. So we're going to say to number, format, date between, and you also get some function suggestions in the Notion pop-up, which is nice. So we're going to say date between and then prop, say end, and comma, prop start. And then we want to specify the units, which is going to be minutes. So we're going to say minutes here. Let's make sure to add quotations. And then let's close this out all together. So then we have our minutes formula. So let's test this out just to make sure that it's giving us the correct number of minutes. So if we say the start date is the 20th, we want to include a time. So let's say 4 p.m. And end, we'll say 4:25 p.m. And we can see here that the minutes is coming in correctly. One of the things to note is with the minutes formula, any formula that's bringing in a number value, you do have the option to show it as a progress bar or as a ring. Because we're working with time, we do want to edit the divide by value. We're going to make this 60 so that a full progress bar essentially means 1 hour. And then let's update the color of the progress bar. The next thing we want to do is start to create our task time entry template and apply our buttons. We can click on create a template here and we'll call this task with time entry. Let's make this full screen. With templates, any properties that you want to pre-fill, you can do that within the template. Because this is a pretty generic template for tasks, we're not going to pre-fill any of this in this example, but we can imagine that if you have social media posts or writing tasks, that you can start to tag them and have filtered views of your tasks. So we have our task with time entry template, and what we're going to do here is first create a toggle, and we're going to call this time entry. And I want to put the buttons in a toggle just so that if we have tasks that we're not really tracking time, but we're using the body of the page, we don't necessarily have to see the buttons by default. We've got time entry here. The next thing we're going to do is create a call out, and we'll say add time entry. We'll update the icon here with a stopwatch. And then the next thing I want to do is drop in a few empty rows into this call out, which is going to allow us to create columns. So we're going to turn these rows into columns. And that way we can have these buttons show up side by side. So from here, let's add the buttons outside and then we'll drag them in after. So we're going to type /button. What we want to do is edit pages, and we're going to say this page. We're essentially changing the timer status. We're going to change to running, and we're going to capture the start date and time, which is going to be set to now. So we've got edit this page. Now what we want to do is edit a property. First, we want to change the timer status to running, and we want to get the start date and time, and we're going to select now. So difference between now and today is today's just grabbing the date, whereas now is grabbing the date and time. We've got now, and that's essentially all we need for the start button. Got to make sure we name the button. So we're going to call this start, and also give it a stopwatch, but maybe we'll make this green, and then click done here. So we've got our start button. Now let's create a stop button. Let's name this button stop, and make this red. So we're going to add a step, and we're going to edit pages in the task database. So we're going to edit a page in the database, and we're going to give one more filter to select any task or time entry that's currently running. So when we have pages to edit, we're going to update this. We're going to add a filter, and we're going to say where the timer status is running. That's the page that we want to change using this button. So we've got that page highlighted. Now what we want to do is edit a few properties. Number one, we're going to change that running status to stopped. And we do want to capture the end date and time. So we're going to select the end property and set that to now. So when we do that, we could see how much time we spent on this task. So we're going to select done here. And then last step is just drag these into this call out. So we have them side by side. And let's make this a little bit smaller. So now we've got our call out within the time entry toggle. So let's test this out just to see how it works. We're going to go into the Write 1.0 of video script. This is a task. Let's make this full screen. And we're going to apply the template that we created, which is going to bring in this call out. So let's say we're starting this task. I'm going to go ahead and click start. So we can see here that it changed two things. The timer status is now running, and the start date and time is captured. So we're going to work in this task, wait a little bit, and then press that stop button. We've worked on this task for a bit. We're going to go ahead and click the stop button. And what that is going to do is capture the end date and time, change the timer status to stopped, and capture the number of minutes via the formula that we set up. So if we were to go back into our time tracking page, we could have a view that's just giving us the number of minutes. So I can add a new view here. We'll make this a simple list view where the only property that we're showing is going to be the number of minutes here. So let's escape out of that, and we can see that we've got the minutes. Let's rearrange this so that the status is toward the end. And one thing to note as a reminder, you can show status as either the specific status or as a checkbox. So we can escape this and see that these are now representing the status more simply in a checkbox. So we can mark these as done. And then we can also sort this by a few different parameters, either by due date is maybe descending, so the most recent comes up first. And if we did want to show the due date and have that present as well, we've got a pretty minimal task list that's showing not only what's done, but how many minutes we spent on this task. Next thing we want to do is set up a new task template with a different set of buttons. and walk through some of the differences and some of the pros and cons between this version and the multiple time entry version. Let's see how we're doing from our original outline. What we want to get into is option 2, and the main properties that we're adding are the self-relation between the task databases and itself, and we'll get into why we need that next. So let's close this out. We're going to open a task, and let's make this full screen. So we've got a task here. We're going to add a property. We're going to select relation. And here we're going to select tasks. Now we are in tasks already, but what this is going to do is allow us to create time entries related to another task. And then we'll be able to tag them differently so that we could see only time entries or only tasks depending on the view for our task database. So we're going to select task. Some differences here. In this case, we want to separate the directions, which is going to mean that we create 2 new properties instead of just one. So the first property that we're creating, we're going to call this time entries. And in the related property, we're going to call this master task. So we're going to select add relation. We've got that there. And then let's just rearrange this a little bit so that it's easier to navigate. We'll have all of the timer related properties toward the bottom. So we've got start, end, timer status, and the number of minutes. And then we have these relations here that we could quickly reference. So now that we have those set up, let's go ahead and create a new task template with a slightly different set of buttons. We're going to set up a new task template for the scenario where we're tracking multiple time entries for the same task. So in this dropdown, what we're going to do is actually duplicate the template that we just set up. And let's open this full screen, and we're going to change this to with multiple time entries. And from here, what we're going to do is let's get rid of these buttons. So we're going to get rid of this one, and we're just going to recreate these. But one thing I do want to do is set up these columns so that we have these spaces to drag our buttons in after we're done. So I'm going to turn this into columns. Okay, so first type / button. We're going to say, let's give this a name first, start, and we'll give it a stopwatch icon, and we'll set this to green. So from here, what we want to do is add a page to the task database, a little bit different than the previous button. So if we click add a step and add pages to, we're going to select our task database, and we're going to give this a name. We'll just say time entry for now. And the next thing we want to do is edit properties within this new page. So first, we want to make sure that these time entries are related to this master task so that when we set up a view of all the time entries related to a task, we can make sure that connection is there and is working. So in this case, we're going to change the master task to this page. So when we click the start button, it's going to create a new time entry, connect it to this page as a master task, and then start the timer and then mark the timer as running. So we're going to select this page, then we're going to change the timer status to running, and we're going to capture the start date and time that is now. So we've got these properties set up, and then press done. Next thing we want to do is set up a new button to stop the timer. So say stop, stopwatch. We're going to make this red. And then from here, we want to edit pages in our task database. And we want to look for specifically the page where the timer is running. So from here, we can actually set up a filter. And instead of all pages in the task database, we want to only change the one where the timer status is set to running. And now from there, we could make changes to that time entry, specifically going into the timer status and marking it as stopped, and then also gathering the end date and time and setting that to now. So we've got these two buttons set up. Let's drag these into place so that they're within the toggle. And then the next thing we want to do is add a filtered view of the task database where we can see all the time entries related to this master task. So if you've got a bigger task where you've had multiple time entries, you could quickly see how many entries there were and then maybe the sum of the total minutes that you've spent on that task. So we're going to click / linked view of database. We're going to again select the task database. Let's make a new empty view. And we're going to keep this as a table view. We're going to remove the database title, which we don't need. And then from here, what I want to do next is click filter and only show time entries where the master task is this page. So because we're filtering to this template page, what's going to happen is every time we use this template, it's going to update to only show time entries related to whatever the name of the task is. So this will change to the name of the task automatically, which is nice. So we've got that filter set up. What I want to do next is go into the menu and go into properties and remove any properties that I don't really need to see here, which is most of them. So I'm going to hide all by default and then go in and decide what properties do I want to see in this view, which I think are particularly the number of minutes and the start date for this time entry. So we're going to look for minutes and the start date. And then let's rearrange these. I think we'll use that format for now. And then let's just reformat this so that it's a little bit more compact and fits within our callout. So now that we've got this set up, let's create a header and we'll call this time entries for this task. And then a little division, we're gonna select these and drag them into our callout and then drag our table into our callout as well. So now that we've got this set up, we can just expand it when we need it and then collapse it when we are not using it. One thing to note, if you're using this version of time entries for a single task, you'll start to see all of these time entry additions in your task database. So there's a quick and easy way to remove those or hide them by default. If you set up a filter and we select the master task is set to empty, what this is going to do is hide any tasks where there is no master task, which means that we're bringing in the actual tasks and not the time entries. So conversely, if you wanted to only show time entries, we would set this to not empty. But in this case, we can save this, and that way we could only see the tasks and not time entries. We're going to go into a task that already has multiple time entries logged. So if I go down into the bottom here, we can see here there's 2 time entries and there's one that's currently running. So if I were to click stop, that's going to log this current time entry. And one thing that might be useful is seeing the total number of minutes that you've spent on a task. So we can go in here, if you're in table view, and calculate the sum of minutes, and that's going to give us a total number of minutes on this task. You may also want this as a property within the task, which in this case, you can see here that the timer properties are empty because those are being logged in the time entries themselves and not in the parent task. But what you could do is create a rollup. And a rollup is anything that's bringing in information from a related database. So we're going to select the time entries database. And what we want to grab is the number of minutes. And then we want to get the sum. I'll call this total time logged. And then in this case, instead of giving us the times individually, we can ask for the sum. And then that's going to give us the total number of minutes logged on this task. So in this case, it might make sense to make this as a different color so that if you're seeing these values in the same space, you can differentiate between time entry minutes and task total minutes. Getting into the weeds there a little bit, but something to keep in mind there. So from here, this is an example of when we've got tasks where you are regularly into it in small bits and pieces. Before we get into our time tracking dashboard, a couple of things that we want to add, mainly to be able to group these time entries by, in this case, project. So if we were to go into an existing task, you'll notice that if I actually go back into the last example, we have these time entries here. If I were to open the time entry page, you'll notice that it's not tied to the parent project the same way the task is tied to the project. So one thing we want to do is roll up the project from the master task to have it connected to the time entry. That's a mouthful. Let's see how that works and why we want to do that. So we're going to add a new property, and this is going to be a formula. We're going to call this task project. And here we're going to state we just want to show the project property. So whatever is in that project property up here, we just want to show that down here as well. So the next thing we want to do is roll up this project name from the task to the time entry. If I add a property and go into rollup, we're going to call this timer task project. And then here we're going to select the master task. And then from the master task, we want to grab the task project here and then show original. What this is going to do is, one of the reasons for this workaround is we can't roll up a relation of a relation, if that makes sense. So we do need to turn it into a formula so it shows up as plain text and then roll that up. So if we were to go into one of these time entries, we can now see that the timer task project is now related to that master task, which is the review coaching audit exercise. Now let's take a look at why we would do this and how it could help us group time entries by project. So we're back in my personal workspace, and what we're going to do now is look at setting up a time tracking hub with real time entries over the course of the past week to get a sense of different ways that we could format showing time entries. In here, we've got, just scanning through a couple sections, this is workspaces organized through these key sections: track, actions, projects, areas, and systems. Track is doing things like tracking habits and other elements, but let's jump into actions here. And what we want to do is, in this workspace, actions encompasses tasks, meetings, action items, deliverables, things like that. So it's a catch-all for things that are happening under projects. But what we want to do is set up a new toggle, and we're going to call this time tracking hub. And from here, we're going to add a linked view of a database. We're going to look for actions, which is the first one to show up. We're going to select new empty view here, and what I want to do next is, let's set this up as a table, and we'll turn off vertical lines, turn off the database title because we know that we're looking at actions, and then click done. Next thing we want to do is, you'll notice this is bringing in a bunch of properties that we don't want to see. What I want to do is go into the menu of this linked view database and go to properties. We're going to hide all by default and decide what are the properties that we want to show. What we want to do is set up a filter. And in this case, because we're looking at time entries, what we want to do is look for the master task property. And we're going to say we only want to see entries where the master task is not empty. So what that's going to do is give us only time entries, because time entries need a master task. So this is the only scenario where we're using the master task property. So now that we've got that, what we want to do is filter again, and we're going to create a new filter. And in this case, we're going to only show time entries where the start date was this week. So this is actually the first option to come up. So we don't need to do anything more here, but this is only showing from the 16th to the 22nd. And then let's press escape. So let's save that. And now what we want to do is go and turn on a few properties, specifically let's start with the start date and time. And we want to look for the number of minutes. So let's find that. And the master task that these time entries are related to. So we'll turn that on as well. So we've got these 3 additional properties. Now what I want to do is, because time entry is not really informational in this case, we could slide this over to the far right and slide the master task to the far left. And from here, we can go into group, and we're going to group by start date. And then here we've got some options. It's going to group by relatively by default, but what we want to do is group by specific days. And we're going to set the oldest to be first. And then we're going to go ahead and hide empty groups, which is just going to turn off any days that don't have any time entries. So from here, we can now see that we've grouped time entries by day. We can get the number of minutes. We could even shrink this time entry because it's not really super useful, and then make this a little bit bigger. And then lastly, we could go ahead and calculate the sum of these minutes to see how many minutes we work per day. So we've got minutes. Maybe one more way to sort this information is sorting by the start is going to be ascending. So this is going to go from earliest to latest in the day. So this kind of gives us a good insight as to where did we spend the most time in the day, and where did the time go in relation to master tasks. So that's one way to visualize these time entries. The next thing we're going to look at is how to group by parent project. So we're going to go back into this toggle. We're going to go ahead and close that and create a new one. And we're going to call this time entries by project. And from here, what we're gonna do is actually just duplicate this view that we set up. It's got some filters that we're gonna need, and we don't have to start from scratch. So we're gonna drag and drop this into the new toggle. Now what we wanna do is, instead of grouping by date, we're still gonna filter by the current week, but we wanna group by parent project. So if you remember, one of the properties that we set up was really just bringing in the name of the project as a formula so that we can roll that up from the time entry page. If we go to group, instead of grouping by start date, we're going to group by parent project, which is this formula here. And now what this is doing is, just to break this down, these are emojis to signify the time entry, which is related to the master task, which is related to the parent project. It could look like hieroglyphics, but here we've got projects. So these are all entries within a project database. And we already have that sum because we duplicated this from the previous view. But now we can see where time was spent per project, so that I know for the past week, there was 30 minutes toward business development, there was 16 minutes toward YouTube video, and so on and so forth. In this case, we have two examples. One is grouping by project over the past week, and then one is grouping specifically by date. So we can see time entries from earliest to latest and the sum of minutes per day. Last thing to note, in the demo, I'm going to be adding this Notion page to the YouTube description, but this will be available to duplicate and to play around with. You can explore setting up a time tracker and maybe customizing those buttons, or deciding whether it's adding time entries directly to the task or using the task as a parent page to be able to track multiple time entries. So there's a lot of different ways it could go when it comes to time tracking in Notion. So there was a lot in there, but hopefully this gives you a better idea of not only how to track time, but all the different ways you can leverage buttons and Notion's more powerful databases to build a truly personalized workspace that fits your needs. Also, I'm super curious about how you're using buttons or thinking about using them, so definitely let me know in the comments. And before you go, if you're curious to learn more about Manifest OS and the latest release, check out the link below to get notified as soon as it launches. See you in the next video.